Hey guys, and welcome to the second video on chapter 17, where we'll be talking kind of a combination video where we'll be talking about the economy and also religion. Now, first with the economy, talk about trade. Now, you see a map of trade routes during the Middle Ages, and you notice that you have a lot more maritime routes than land routes. This was because you had a reduced land trade in the Middle Ages. It wasn't that trade ended completely, but the collapse of the Western Roman Empire really reduced the stability of overland trade. You didn't have the Roman legions enforcing safety along these trade routes. You still had Roman roads, but they weren't being kept up the way that they used to. So maritime trade was really what people focused on, and this thrived particularly in the Mediterranean around Italy and the Byzantine ports. One area of Europe that did very well with trade, and they took advantage of these maritime routes, was up here in the north. All right, now we talked about them already with the Vikings at the end of the last video, but Norse merchants, they did great with dominating the trade routes in the North Sea. You see, they went all over the place. They traveled from Russia to Ireland. They did business in, Dublin. They traveled down the Volga, into Constantinople and, did business with the Abbasid Empire. So yes, they were crazed, berserkers and things like that. But a lot of them were just merchants trying to make a buck. Now, feudalism. Feudalism resulted because this was a rural society that was largely decentralized and destabilized. Western Europe did not have many cities going for it during the Middle Ages. You notice that the vast majority of cities are down here in Italy. And this was mostly because of the legacy of stability left by the Romans being close here to Italy, and also because of trade, maritime trade routes centering around Italy through here. Once you start going a little bit farther north and start going a little bit away, you notice that the population centers become much more sparse. You're starting to have some up here, but again, these were really more centered around maritime trade. You didn't have many throughout the majority of Western Europe. So a feudal system emerges. Now, feudalism is kind of based on this idea of land for loyalty, right? And that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but it is based on land ownership. It was based on land being controlled essentially by local warlords. You do have the king up top, but the king did not have a lot of direct control over the land. This was a decentralized system. Local lords and their knights exercised military control over the land. They could grant land to retainers, and these became their vassals. You see, vassals could be to the king, or you could have sub-vassalization. The lords could give land to knights and other lords, and they would swear their oaths of loyalty and allegiance, as you see in the picture here. But it wasn't, exactly like, okay, I'm going to swear an oath, so no, I'm going to do no matter what. These local lords had a tremendous amount of local autonomy, and the military obligations that they would enforce from their knights gave them an awful lot of control as well. And down at the bottom, you have the peasants. Peasants worked the land for the lords and the vassals. Here you see an overseer making sure that the peasants are doing their jobs. They had to work. They didn't have a choice. And as a kind of reward for, if you want to call it that, for their work, they were given the surplus agriculture from the farming, only after the lord and his family were taken care of, obviously. They had very little ability or opportunity to move away or up in society, mostly because they were not paid in money. There was no salary going on for serfs. They were paid in land and being allowed to live and so forth. All aspects of their lives were under the Lord's control. Serfs couldn't even get married to one another without the Lord's permission. So it wasn't that it was slavery, but it was barely a step up from slavery. And life was very, very harsh and rough for these peasants. Many of them did not live past 40 years of age. Now, into a bit on religion, Christianity. You start to see a split during this time between an East and a West. What started out all as one Christian church after it was officially adopted by the Roman Empire, well, it's going to split after the split of the Roman Empire. And in the West and the East, you see a hierarchy emerging. Christianity had a much more hierarchical structure than other religions, right? You don't have a pope in Buddhism. You don't have a series of patriarchs and bishops in Islam. Christianity inherited this tradition from the Roman Empire, and it carried over into both East and West. East had the emperor, who was the head of state and religion, and it also the patriarchs, right, who were appointed in the local cities to make sure, and the patriarch of Constantinople, who kind of ran the show in the East. The West had, oh, sorry, I forgot to go through all this stuff first, right? So you got your pope, you got your cardinals and so forth, right? So even to this day, this is an example of hierarchy. But in the West, what really kind of solidified the hierarchy was the papacy. And here you have the symbol of the papacy here, the symbol of the pope. That's a symbol used even to this day by Pope Francis. In the early days, the Pope was just the Bishop of Rome and kind of was playing along nicely with the bishops of the other major cities of Christianity, Constantinople, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, and so forth. But by the late 6th century, they started to break away. They started to do their own thing. And that really distinguished themselves as a separate branch of Christianity. And the Pope most responsible for this was Pope Gregory I, also known as Gregory the Great. He enforced papal power through the assertion of this thing called papal primacy. He says, I'm the Bishop of Rome, and I have ultimate authority over all other bishops. And he was able to assert his authority directly over Western Christianity, not over the East. Obviously, they were under direct control of the emperor. But in doing so, it was almost kind of gave himself a form of imperial rule over Western Christianity. Well, this would kind of build and extend, and the two sides would continue to butt heads until you have the Great Schism of 1054. And at that point, both the Patriarch and the Pope excommunicated each other, and this would officially split Christianity in two. It became Eastern Orthodox over here, would really be centered around Greece and later Russia, and then you have Roman Catholic in Western Europe. And this obviously still exists to this day. One other thing with religion, talk about the monks, those crazy monks. Now, monks lived what we call a monastic lifestyle. Monasteries were very, very important in the Middle Ages. They were sources of religious instruction. They were also sanctuaries. Here you have the scriptorium. They were one of the few places where literacy survived. The overwhelming majority of people, both lords and peasants in Western Europe, were illiterate. Monasteries are one of the few places where reading and writing survived. They counseled the laity, and they also served as hospitals and schools. They also served as missionaries, friars of certain orders, such as St. Francis. They went out and they tried to spread the gospel in the world and the word of God. Another very important figure in these early days was St. Benedict. St. Benedict, he set forth his rules, and see here is a depiction of him presenting his rules to his fellow monks. He said that in order to truly dedicate ourselves to life, we have to dedicate ourselves in the right way. And he set forth his 3 rules, the Benedictine rules: poverty, obedience, and chastity. And he says we must abide by these rules for monastic life, and they would later be adopted by other levels of the clergy in the Catholic Church as well. All right, so as I said, we're just going to do a couple of quick videos for Chapter 17. That'll wrap it up on that, and hope you enjoyed them.